Welcome to Maxed Out Man, helping you become the man you were made to be.
Hey guys, it's Kevin Davis from the Maxed Out Man podcast. This is episode number 21. We're here with Dr. John Schinnerer, right? That's the proper pronunciation. Dr. John has a PhD and coach for over 20 years, and he now refers to himself as a court jester. So we'll let him explain that a little bit more, but he works with Navy SEALs, CEOs, does consulting, and basically, wants everybody to be the best they can be. We were talking about the Army tagline, be all you can be, earlier. But hey, man, thanks for coming. I appreciate you joining me. And why don't you tell us, that's your basic intro, but I'll let you expound on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Kevin. I appreciate it. Let's see. So I guess to give you the 5-minute version.
Hey, we can take 15. I don't, we got all the time you want.
So I learned early on that I needed to be overachieving and highly success motivated. I think to get the attention and love from my parents was kind of how I figured it out, right? Because they were the same way. And so by a senior in high school, I was killing myself. I was student body president. I was taking advanced courses. I was captain of 3 varsity teams. And I'm sure from the outside looking in, it looked, amazing. Like, wow, he's killing it. And I'm like, no, I'm just killing myself. And my internal experience was, I was proud of what I was doing. And yet I was exhausted all the time. I was depressed some of the time. I was anxious a lot of the time. And generally I was just kind of miserable. And it really started me questioning this idea of success. Like, where is their idea in success for things like happiness, contentment, relaxation, purpose? I just had the questions back then, and it worked. I got into a good college and studied philosophy, which I like to joke prepared me to do absolutely nothing. But 20 years later, I came full circle with positive psychology, to Aristotle's question of what is the good life. And then went into UC Berkeley in a PhD program in psychology. And really the reason I went into that was because I wanted to find out more about the emotional part of me. I'd always been a pretty smart guy, but the dumbest, most embarrassing, most shameful stuff I've done in my life was when that emotional mind was in charge of me, right? Anger, boredom, excitement, depression, anxiety, whatever it was. And I was like, what are these damn things that keep coming up that I can't seem to really get my hands on? And it frustrated me. So fast forward, became a school psychologist, was working in, a high school in Fremont, and the kids would come in and share their stories with me, which were filled with anger, sadness, guilt, shame, fear, rightfully so. I didn't realize at 25 that emotions are contagious, that we can pick them up from other people unless we're trained to do otherwise. And so it ended with me getting depressed. When we get depressed, inflammation in our body goes up. So the old injuries that you have come back. For me, it's my low back. So I remember my back goes out, I'm in pain, I'm depressed, Hope, does a suicide swan dive out the window. And I'm thinking, this is ridiculous. Like, if I can't manage my emotions, how can I teach them to? And so rather than kill myself, I decided to look for the best scientifically proven tools to manage that darker side of ourselves. Anger, fear / anxiety, stress, guilt, shame, sadness / depression. And, that was I would say a third of the answer, but it helped. Now I had a lot of tools to teach others. And fast forward, I left the school district, did an entrepreneurial venture for about 7 years. It went well until the economy crashed. And then my company crashed as well, which that brought up a lot of issues around, failure.
Yeah, your success. If
failure is a man,
success right? Based on that, right?
That our masculinity is tied up in that shit. And so I had to reinvent myself, and I started getting into positive psychology, which is the scientific pursuit of happiness, purpose, meaning, positive emotions, engagement, flow. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And I got really excited after reading, 1,000 studies. And I thought, people need to know this, because now I've got the tools to turn down the volume on the negative and tools to turn up the volume on the positive. And I wrote like 600 pages of a book on how to coach people towards a successful and happy life. And then I thought, shit, no one's going to read 600.
Yeah, 600 pages is a
Even
lot.
if they want to be happy, it's like, no, screw it. What's the Cliff Notes?
Tolstoy does psychology, right?
So, but that rough draft got me a radio show in the Bay Area, and they asked me, and it was a Christian radio station, which, I kind of stepped in it a couple times, but it was a live daily primetime radio show, which when it was offered to me, that really kicked my anxiety into high gear, because Berkeley doesn't train you to do radio shows.
Right.
Berkeley,
and it's live, right? You were probably, yeah.
And Berkeley trains you that the only things you can say have to be backed up by good studies, which doesn't really motivate anyone to do anything.
Yeah, because then you're just following, you're kind of creating a narrative based on the studies. It's factually based.
Yeah, it speaks purely to your intellect.
Yeah,
and I don't think our intellect motivates us at a core level to do much of anything.
Right.
The intellect comes in after the fact and creates the narrative, but I would say it's more the emotional mind is what we need to speak to in order to get people to be willing to change. And so I had to learn over time how to emote on air, how to be authentic and vulnerable, how to tell a joke in a vacuum, which is weird, to tell a joke and there's no response. I could see my producers laughing on the other side of the glass, but there's no audio feedback. I'm like, right, this is really weird. I learned how to tell stories, and then I got to interview a bunch of world-class experts, which was incredible. So I kept learning and ended that after a year, opened up private practice in Danville, started with positive psychology, which back in 2005 was kind of lukewarm. So I turned to anger management, which is where I really started working intensely with men, although, women are angry too. Something which was made abundantly clear to me when I created an online anger management course. And this was a while back. And the people that were advising me said, find a niche. So I was like, okay, anger management.
Riches are in the niches, right?
Yeah. And so I was like, and so I went live with it, and I started getting emails from angry women all around the world, like, hey buddy, we're pissed off too. What about us? I was like, sorry, it's not personal. They just told me to find a niche. So I changed it.
That's like the most ironic thing ever, that they're pissed off about an anger management course, and so they're sending you angry emails.
It was, I was laughing behind the scenes. Anyway, so started doing anger management, got tired of that after about 10 years, and started working more with executives and businessmen and kind of high performers, so to speak. And that, what I realized pretty quickly is that in my estimation, in my opinion, the biggest source of their pain was actually at home and was actually in their relationships, which, often could be extended to the relationships at work, but the biggest source was at home with their spouse. And then, by extension, the teenage kids at that point and so on and so forth. So I started teaching them relational skills, how to be better in relationship. And one of the things I love about that is I could work with the CEO, for example, and say, here's a tool that works. I want you to practice this with your wife. And, oh, by the way, this works with your kids as well. And, oh, guess what? Bonus, this also works with all your employees as well. And then started looking more recently at masculinity and man box culture. And how...
And explain what man box. I've not heard that term before. Maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. So, thanks for asking. So, man box culture is how we are socialized, starting out as really young boys, and this really takes place in most of the cultures on the planet. There's a few exceptions, but how we're socialized in terms of what we learn it means to be a real man. What are the rules of manhood? And research shows it starts about the age of 4 or 5, as soon as we get in groups of boys, so preschool, kindergarten, starts out innocently enough, and then, kind of picks up speed as we get to middle school and high school, and never really stops for some of us, especially for those in paramilitary organizations like police, fire, or the actual military. And the rules consist of things like don't back down, be aggressive, compete, dominate women, be self-reliant, be the provider, don't ask for help, don't be gay, don't be feminine. And, there's a few others. And we can argue kind of, the good and bad of each of those. And I think, just like, and I've really thought about each of these, like be self-reliant. Like in general, that's a pretty good value. But if we think about self-reliance on a 1 to 10 scale, where 1 is I'm completely dependent on another person or other people, that doesn't really feel good to me. And if you take it all the way to a 10, I don't rely on anybody. I'm not going to ask anybody for help. I'm going to do it all by myself.
Mm-hmm.
That's more common in the men that I work with, that extreme, that end of the scale. And it's really problematic.
Yeah, I tend to vacillate between 5 and 10. Like, but I have to be very deliberate. I have to be very deliberate to pull myself, because my family situation was weird, and raised myself from 7 and all this stuff. So I became a workaholic and blah blah blah. But I have to then be, and I try to do everything I do deliberately, but I have to be deliberate to move away from my natural tendency to be, because I always had to be self-reliant.
Yeah.
And
So
I think
it was a survival strategy.
Yeah, so it became a survival strategy. But yeah, being closer to the middle of that continuum is definitely more advantageous overall.
Well, I think we want to vacillate somewhere between, maybe a 4 to a 8, but we have to do that with intention, with mindfulness. And because I've seen too many men that like won't ask for help when they're depressed, when they're anxious, and have a great deal of shame about it. I've seen men that won't ask for help or won't go to a doctor, or they have a rotting tooth and they won't go see a dentist, like that kind of stuff. That's really problematic.
Yeah, that's kind of dumb. It's like also, it's like my arm fell off, and I can totally take care of it. Where's the
Black Knight and Monty Python and the Holy Grail, right?
It's just a flesh wound, right?
So we can argue kind of the good and bad of it, but the biggest problem that I see is this rule of be stoic, don't feel. And how are we for swearing on this podcast?
You do whatever you got to do.
Okay.
Sometimes the swear word is the best word.
Well, I'm not swearing just to swear. I'm swearing to describe what we go through growing up.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And so I apologize in advance if this offends anyone. It's not meant to. It's just meant to. I think we have to talk about this.
Yeah.
So when we're growing up, and this is, I would usually say middle school to high school, if you show too much sadness or fear in front of others, because a lot of people tell me, a lot of men say, well, like, I never got this stuff from my dad. Okay, fair enough. You don't have to get it from your dad, although you might. Where you will get it is from peers, maybe coaches, athletic coaches, and definitely from media, movies, social media, all that stuff.
Especially now, it's even so much worse than, because you and I are similar age. We didn't have that, didn't have that issue. Really.
And so if you show too much sadness or fear in front of others, at some point you're going to get these messages. One of these messages: don't be a pussy, don't be a little bitch, don't be a little girl.
Yep.
Now there's other insults I can throw in there, but those 3 are the epitome of the feminine.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, truly the height of the feminine. And the message there is, don't be feminine.
Right.
And I don't think it takes getting that message many times. I've really thought about this maybe 3 or 4 times. And we go, holy shit, I'm never showing that again. That's painful. It's embarrassing. It's humiliating. It disconnects me. It
makes me
a sense of belonging. Yeah. Yeah. And so we jump back in the man box and we shut that side of ourselves down. On the other side of the emotional spectrum, if we show too much joy, love, romanticism, excitement, flamboyance, God forbid, if we move our body in the wrong way, literally, we'll get, don't be gay, don't be a fag.
Yeah.
Again, I don't think it takes many times getting that message before you're like, I'm never showing that again.
Yeah.
And I mean, I remember in elementary school, there was tests like, how do you look at your fingernails? And if you looked at your fingernails one way versus another way, one was gay and one was not. How do you?
Oh yeah, because you got. I never actually thought about that, but
if you've got something on the bottom of your shoe, how do you look at it? If you pick up that foot and put it in front of your plant leg versus behind your plant leg, one of those apparently, was gay and one was not.
That's crazy.
Like that's how stupid this shit is, though.
Yeah.
But it's so pervasive. And so the question then becomes, what emotions can we cop to or can we demonstrate without fear of humiliation, without fear of disconnection from our male peers? And I would say it's 3 things. I would say it's lust, Because if I'm with a group of guys and I say, oh, look at that ass in those jeans, or she's so hot I would sleep with her, it signals I'm straight. So that's safe.
Yeah.
And that's where I think, catcalling kind of comes into this whole man box piece, which I am not a fan of at all.
Yeah.
By the way, I never understood that as a strategy. Like, what do you think that woman's going to come back and like,
Yeah.
want your digits? Like, seriously,
Yeah.
what's the purpose of that?
Not once in the history of that exchange has it ever resulted in a woman, unless she's does it.
My
for a
daughter's
living.
17 and she gets that a lot and it pisses me off.
So dumb.
Anyway, so there's lust, there's stress, because if I tell you, hey, Kevin, man, I've been so stressed lately, it kind of implies I'm busy or important. So that's safe. And the big one is anger, some degree of anger. And think of anger on a 1 to 10 scale in terms of intensity, a little bit irritated, slightly annoyed, kind of frustrated, all the way to anger to 5, all the way to incredible Hulk enraged at a 10. But anger is safe for us because who's going to call you out when you're already angry?
Right.
And that anger dynamic is so destructive for us because if you and I are in an argument and we're at a 5 or above on that anger scale, all I'm trying to do is get you to understand how right I am and how wrong you are. And I'm externalizing all blame for the situation onto you. It's all your fault. If you would just stop being such a fill in the blank, I wouldn't be so pissed off.
Yeah. And you're using that to intimidate and
when it's useless, right? Like, what's the point of that other than you're out of control with your anger? And the thing that kills me about this is it's such a go-to emotion for the vast majority of us, but it completely separates us from the possibility of learning, growth, and evolution.
Mm-hmm.
Because it completely cuts us off from introspection. It completely disconnects us from, that curiosity of, what's my part in this? Like, what did I do to upset Kevin? And what can I work on?
Mm-hmm.
What could I maybe do differently? So, I mean, that's a little bit about the man box. And I think it's just tragic. Here's the other big takeaway for listeners is I really like this idea because it's not our fault. None of this is our fault in the sense that we did not ask to be socialized like this. It just happens.
Mm-hmm.
And it happens, I believe, as a way for society to create soldiers because it only happens in areas or countries where we have bordering neighbors and we have scarce natural resources. So there's a threat of invasion of someone taking whatever those resources might be. In island cultures where resources are plentiful and there's no bordering neighbor, masculinity develops in a far different way. There's a tripartite or tripolar version of masculinity where you've got somewhat more traditional masculine, you've got traditional feminine, and then somewhere in the middle is this hybrid. And it's okay for men or women to be that. And it's very accepted. Like if you think of a lot of Pacific Island cultures, it's very loving and nurturing of the man or the father to cook the meals for the family, for example.
Right.
Or to wear skirts, for example. I mean, different climates, but so all this stuff is fascinating to me because it tells me that it's driven by culture, driven by society, and it's learned.
And even I think that actually exists in even, far more male dominated, even if it's quote unquote male dominated, that ideal of masculinity actually would lean more towards what we would consider in the Western world to be more effeminate.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the whole thing kind of fascinates me. And I don't think most men that I talk to even stop to think about this. And it's the mask that we wear because we're trying not to show our emotions. And there's absolutely no space between ourself and the mask. And so
right.
One of the things I like about this concept is I think it's a way to allow men to get a slight breath of air or slight psychological distance between self and mask to begin to be curious about it in a non-defensive way and just say, so what parts of masculinity are working for me? What parts would I like to change, and how would I like to change them? What's the impact of my masculinity on people around me that I care about?
Yeah.
How can I be more secure in my masculinity rather than having an insecure masculinity?
which I'm convinced that all men are insecure. Like I at the core of who we are, I think a lot of our, or I've come to believe that a lot of our behavior ideals and morals are based on our own insecurities. And again, the way to deal with your insecurity is to throw on a mask.
Yeah. One, to externalize blame for it too.
Yeah.
To put our worst parts out and project them onto some vulnerable group, for example.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because I think that whole behavior that you're talking about in avoiding the effeminate, it presumes that the feminine is weak, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I think that's at the center of that. My wife and I, so my wife was a stay-at-home mom, then kind of turned rally racer, car builder, SEMA. She's a welder.
Wow,
she does
awesome.
baking. And so that gave us an opportunity to actually, she did 2 all-female builds for this trade show called SEMA, which is the Specialty Equipment Manufacturers Association. It's in Vegas every year, the largest automotive trade show in the world. So like people have this goal as a car builder to get a vehicle into this show. And she's had her vehicle that she's personally built twice, and then 2 other vehicles that she's built with all female teams. Wow. So she and I, I'm fortunate because I'm self-employed that she and I were able to participate in this. And I'm obviously I was like the sandwich boy and the guy that swept up, but we're surrounded by 70 to 80 tradeswomen that are, extremely strong, well-versed in a male-dominated culture and all that. So like when I think of, and, I always joke and say they would throw quarters down on the ground so I would bend over and pick them up. I got that. I got that reverse sexual harassment, which was an interesting. My wife said, "Oh, you loved it," and I was like, "Well, okay." But this idea of the feminine being weak, Trevor Noah has this whole bet about the pussy, right? Yeah. I don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah,
bit,
I love Trevor Noah.
Yeah, but the idea that the feminine is the weaker part of the weaker choice has always just fascinated me because it's, I
think it's not out of fear, right?
Yeah.
That, we men can't give birth. And so I think out of that insecurity or fear, we needed to put it down because we need to put down the feminine because it threatens the hell out of us. We need to control it. I forgot where I was going with that. Oh, I was going to say that your wife is actually, because your wife is an exemplar of what we're shooting for in a sense, because I've been on interviews like this and someone said once, well, it seems like you're arguing for the wussification of men. I'm like, well, you haven't been listening, because what I'm arguing for is an embrace or an acceptance of our full spectrum of humanity over masculinity. So I want the clients that I work with to have full access to every part of their humanity and then select those parts that serve them best in any given context or situation. So for example, if I'm playing rugby or soccer, it works for me to be traditionally masculine.
Right.
Be tough, be aggressive, don't back down, be competitive, play for the win, all that stuff. And I've done that. If I'm on date night with my significant other, it pays for me to have access to different aspects of me, to be loving, romantic, poetic, even, to be calm, to be nurturing. And, there's other masculine parts of that too, protective, like, and I'm okay.
Yeah. If you come around the corner and there's a group of guys that are there to try to rob
or to
you,
open doors or, pull the chair out, like, and then if I'm with my, let's say 2-year-old daughter and she falls and skins her knee, then I need to be, again, calm, nurturing, gentle, quiet, reassuring. And I think most men that I work with only have, they have limited access to some of these parts of themselves, or maybe they're embarrassed or out of touch with some of these parts. And so, I have nothing against traditional masculinity, but it's one tool in the toolbox.
Mm-hmm.
It's one gear in the car, right? And you need multiple gears.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah. So, I mean, like in my case, to get that opportunity to see, and I've talked about it on the podcast before, but the interesting thing about this group of women is that they're in a male dominated field and they actually tend to go to the other side of the continuum, which they put on they kind of wear these false bravado masculine identities in order to protect themselves, because men in those trades are just dicks. I mean, that's just, they treat women like crap. Yeah, very man box. They treat women like crap. They assume they don't know anything.
See them as sexual objects.
I mean, these women are, and I say guys, but these women are professional welders that weld on titanium and make $250,000 a year, and all have businesses and all this stuff, and yet but I always think it's interesting because they then will put on what we would see as a masculine set of traits.
And you bring up a really good point, because gender is separate from sex. Mm-hmm. So I look at gender as masculine to feminine and all the variations in between, and sex is male to female along a spectrum. But those two aren't, like, you can have a masculine or a masculine dominated female. I mean, that was my mom. Or you can have a more feminine male, and anywhere in between. And a lot of women that I talk to that are in like corporate USA, they have to adopt more masculine traits as a means of survival and as a means of being successful climbing the ladder.
Yeah. To not be dominated, like anti-domination.
Yeah. Well, and to enforce firm boundaries too sometimes.
Yeah.
It's an interesting game that they play, because
and it's,
I mean, again, in corporate USA, women, they're in a double bind in a big way, in the sense of if they show too much emotion, they're too emotional, they're too feminine. Mm-hmm. If they don't show any emotion at all, they're a cold-hearted bitch. And there's not even a line to walk, because it's based on the other person's perception of them, and they're going to be judged harshly on either side of that line.
Yeah, it's I don't envy that at all. I talk to Michelle, my wife, about that all the time, and she is actually a very feminine woman. So like, this is she, like I said, she kind of reinvented herself after our girls left, and but it was very difficult. So she did these off-road rallies, and so she's surrounded by these women that have that kind of, they lean towards the masculine in terms of how they, they're badasses, and they don't need any, they go on the other side of that continuum from a female standpoint. I don't need anybody. I'm self-reliant. I don't need no man, that, I mean, seriously, like you say that stuff. And for her, it was like, she and I have developed this relationship where we do almost everything together. So we've built brands, and the brands are based on us, which has been great for us because it gives us an opportunity to show people what a marriage of 28 years can actually look like, and what that relation, because it's weird, right? It's weird to have a happy marriage after 28 years.
Yeah, who does that? That's countercultural right there.
I know. I don't know what we're doing wrong.
That's revolutionary. Who are you?
It's yeah, right. That's it is a little crazy. But with her in particular, one of the things that we've noticed is that she tends to be the kind of the girly girl, goody person, but she essentially has been able to kind of embrace what would be a more masculine man's role, but also maintain that. And then this is what draws people to her. And we've actually seen people kind of been drawn to her and kind of reach out to her in that way.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It sounds like she has access to all parts of herself.
Oh, she definitely does.
Which I think is what we're shooting for. Self-awareness is a foundational skill. And without self-awareness, there's no possibility of growth, because you think you're doing great. And research from Tasha Eurich shows that 95% of us will self-report being highly self-aware. And in truth, it's only about 10 to 15% of us, which is a massive problem.
Yeah.
Because if we all,
and shows how not self-aware we are. Right?
Yeah. And in truth, we're actually creatures of habit. We are automatons. Most of us go through life mindlessly and just following habits without much thought or awareness or intention. And so self-awareness is a foundational skill. Without that, the growth doesn't happen, because you don't think you need any growth.
Right.
And there's two relatively easy ways to begin to build self-awareness, metacognition. And metacognition is thinking about thinking. And one of the key skills that you want to develop there is this idea of psychological distance, or being able to step out of that thought stream and get some distance from it so you're not fused with your thought stream. So when that thought comes of, I'm an idiot, I don't believe that offhand, like just immediately, and then start looking for evidence to support the thought of I'm an idiot, because I can find evidence to support that in my past because I've done stupid stuff, but it just ruins the emotional quality of the moment or hour or day for me. So
it's a matter of recognizing that you're telling yourself you're an idiot, and then be able to process that on an emotional.
Yeah, the idea is that we can't stop the thoughts from coming. So let's say in my case, I may still have that thought of, oh, I'm such a dumbass.
Yeah.
Which is kind of one of my classic Hall of Fame negative automatic thoughts.
Me too.
So that thought may still come, but you can't stop the thoughts from coming, but you can change how you relate to the thought. So now, on a good day, I'll see that thought and I'll be like, that's bullshit. Like, I've seen that before. I'm just going to let it go. I'm not going to stop and dwell on it and look for evidence to support it.
Right.
And so the easiest ways to begin to build this skill is to simply pause 3 times a day, take a deep breath, and ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? And do a body scan and just kind of check in, what's my heart rate doing? Where am I holding muscle tension? How's my GI tract doing? What's my throat doing? Shoulders, neck, that kind of thing. And that also builds the skill of interoception, which is our awareness of the internal workings of our organs, which is key in all this. But the beautiful thing about this is that studies show that just doing this 3 times a day will help build metacognition and self-awareness. And the kicker to it is the answer doesn't matter. So take your best shot. You can't screw it up. I love things that we can't screw up. The other one that I'll throw out there is from Ethan Kross in his book Chatter, which is a brilliant book on, kind of silencing that internal critic. And he's one of the world's leading experts in this area. And one of the things that came out of his research is one of the best ways to create psychological distance between you and that thought swamp in your head is to speak to yourself in the second or third person. So if you think about when the shit's hitting the fan and you're losing your mind and you're getting overwhelmed by emotion, what does it sound like in your head? What do the thoughts sound like? And for me, it's like, oh my God, I can't take it anymore. I can't deal with this. Like, I'm losing my mind. Like, this sucks. But it's all I, me, or my, right? First person singular.
Right.
And so in that thinking, in those thoughts, you can hear the tone of voice or the emotion in those thoughts, which is funny because there's no actual voice, but that's beside the point. But I am fused with my thoughts. There's no distance between myself and the pain that I am in. I am in it.
Yeah.
I am one with it. Now, if you can have awareness in those moments, or maybe before those moments, and start to speak to yourself, I'll just use third person because that's what I do. John, take a deep breath. You're going to be fine. Relax. Yeah, this is tough and you can handle this. And you can hear how there's a different emotion behind those thoughts, but it gives you distance between yourself and the difficult situation. And it's the easiest way to gain psychological distance that we know of. We've known for years that psychological distance is important, but all the interventions up to this point have taken more cognitive load or thinking. This takes very little. And so it's a great skill to practice and play around with.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's almost like a mind-body connection, but it's almost like an out-of-body, mind-body, or out-of-mind, mind-body connection.
That's what you're trying to create. I mean, because at this point in my career, I don't look at myself as my mind anymore. I think when I was younger, I highly over-identified with the thinker, right? With my ego. John. Ooh, John's smart. Ooh, John does amazing shit. Ooh, John's in such good shape. Oh, John got an F on that test. John sucks. He's a loser. He's stupid. Like that shit's too painful. It's too volatile. So now I see myself as this entity which kind of floats above my mind and can look down on my mind and say, oh, well, there's that thought again of I'm amazing. I'm just blowing smoke up my ass. I don't need that. Or there's that thought again of I'm an idiot. That's not true. I'm not going to believe that. And so it's interesting how that's developed. And over time, I've even played around with ways to connect to source with the goal of 100% physical relaxation and egolessness or ego death, which that's amazing. But so far I've only been able to stay there for, moments.
So I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about this whole self-awareness and maybe how it fits into compartmentalization.
Please.
So for me, I've never been special teams person. However, I've never been military, but I've done a little bit of study on how the brain works with these special teams guys, and how their compartmentalization works in terms of they can get less sleep. They can compartmentalize the actions that they need to do. I'm not a military guy, like I said. However,
You have the neck of a military man.
oh, that's great. I don't know if that's a compliment.
That's a compliment.
Oh, good. That is a compliment. So, but I tend to compartmentalize things. So I went through a really kind of crazy childhood thing. My mom was a drug addict, alcoholic, ended up kind of raising myself from the age of 7, age of 8. And so I have learned to compartmentalize all of that information and kind of be able to set that aside. So I'm aware of it, but it's not one of those things where I end up kind of bringing it up to the surface. So I'm self-aware of it. However, I don't bring all those things to kind of the surface and be able to talk through it and all of those. I've kind of set this aside, and I'm pretty comfortable with how it works. So because I went through so much stress and so much trauma kind of as a young kid that it isn't that bad in what I go through now.
Wow. I'm sorry about that. That's rough.
So with that in mind, like, how do you justify, or how do you kind of bring together this idea of compartmentalization and self-awareness and kind of dealing with those things? How does that work? I'm interested in knowing kind of, where to go and maybe do a little bit of psychoanalysis on my part.
Well, it's a great question. And I guess I can respond with my own, personal experience or experience in my life. So my partner, whom I've been with for 7 years, she's a therapist. She prided herself on being self-aware. Her father committed suicide when she was 10, which is going to leave a mark. Lot of trauma in her family and like past generational trauma. And she developed certain strategies to survive. And one of the strategies she developed was thinking her emotions. And I began to gently call her out on this. And, more recently she's had an awakening where she's starting to feel all the shit that she hasn't felt for 35 years. And it's brutal at times to actually feel the stuff you've buried for 35 years. Anguish, grief, anger, sadness, disconnection, fear. And so, I think the work is never ending. Like, I'm going to be working on myself until I die. And that's a privilege, right? It's a gift. And sometimes it's a really painful gift that I'm not appreciative of. Like, I'm pissed off about it. And yet I think it's the only heroic journey left for us. Because if you consider, like, we've explored all the land on this planet, pretty much. We've explored the vast majority of the oceans to the extent we can reach the depths. We've explored outer space to the extent we can so far. The only remaining heroic journey is inward. And that journey requires a lot of courage. And you're going to be exposed to your shadows, your demons, the parts of yourself that it's much easier to externalize onto others and project blame onto others. And to face your own shit is terrifying and ultimately highly rewarding. I think it's the only thing left to do. It's my own personal journey, which I started in a very intellectual way, reading books and talking to people. And that kept me at an intellectual level, which was safe. but I was learning. As I got more into it, I had to go to an emotional level, which is a little bit like opening Pandora's box, because you can't control all those emotions when you first open and take the lid off that box. And that part's, a little scary. Like, I've had men tell me, well, like, I don't really want to go into my emotions, because if I do, it's like scratching a scab that will start bleeding and will never stop. And I think our fear there is of, like, crying, God forbid, in front of other people. And I get the fear. I do. I've had it myself. And yet again, I think it's the only way to deal with those fears is to go through them, to walk into them. And then after dealing with it on an emotional level, which I still have to deal with at times, then it was a relational level. So where am I in relationship, in my development as being a partner in relationship? And what do I need to work on there? And what's it bringing up in me? And what do I need to heal in myself that can only be healed when I'm in relationship? Like, there's some parts of me that I can't heal if I'm by myself. And then more recently, I've been looking at it as spiritual dimension and trying to look at how do I develop that more spiritual side of myself. So that's been kind of my journey. In terms of men that I work with, I typically go to self-awareness first. I typically go to emotional awareness first, because most of us are incredibly over-identified with the thinker, because that's how we've been socialized. That's where we were rewarded. Think of getting good grades in class, or getting a degree, or getting a promotion, or, getting kudos for a project well done. All that's about thinking and the intellect, and it's safe. And so then the next level is to go to, like, how many emotions can you name? Because the vast majority of people can only name like 3 emotions in their body: happy, sad, mad. And, it's one of the reasons I wrote a book many years ago after being, coming out of graduate school, is I realized I was still an idiot emotionally. And I'm like, I have a PhD in psychology. Like, if I'm still an idiot emotionally, everyone else has to be too. And so I just started getting really curious about it. And I think, that's one of the things that's a necessary precursor is humility, is to understand just how much you don't know.
Oh, 100%. That's totally true.
And I think that's a really healthy attitude, that I would rather know that there's a shit ton of information out there that I just do not know, than to think I know it all.
Yeah, I actually posted a meme that basically says, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. And I like that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I'm very, tend to think I'm an idiot and how dumb I am.
Yep.
And I use that as language that I talk to myself about all the time. So I don't know how self-deprecation versus humility works,
Yeah.
but I know that there's something we need, to deal with in terms of bridging that gap between self-deprecation, humor, and telling ourselves we're dumbasses all the time.
Yeah. Welcome to the club. We have jackets.
Yeah, I definitely need one of those jackets, I think, for sure. So how do you kind of give guys an initial piece of advice to get started on this journey and kind of the self-awareness and humility and all of these things we've been discussing about? Kind of where would the average person get started with?
Oh man, there's a lot to that. I can say that one of the things that has helped me is to try my best. I wouldn't say I'm great at it, but to try my best to appreciate and walk into those experiences where life just breaks me down and brings me to my knees, because I know that's an area that is just ripe for growth. And there was a philosopher back when this is one of the few things I remember about my philosophy. I think it was Jacques. Yeah, it was a lot of money for that one piece of knowledge. Shit. But I think it was the French philosopher Jacques Derrida who said that what is required for true growth is a radical shattering of one's framework. And I have always loved that idea, right? That there's going to be times in life where we get brought to our knees, usually by external circumstances. And we necessarily are forced to take the glasses off through which we view the world and throw them on the ground and shatter them, which necessitates getting on your knees and repiecing the pieces back together, which is necessarily going to form a new way, a new lens through which we see self and world. And there's nothing better for growth than that. And in fact, for some people, that's the only way growth happens. And then for some people, those incidents happen and no growth takes place. So what would you rather do? If you're going to experience the pain anyway, might as well use it for positive ends. And so I think there's situational humility, those times where things happen and you just get humbled and blindsided and brought to your knees. And then I think there's humility as a trait. And, I think part of that is valuing humility. Part of that is valuing curiosity. Part of that is having an awareness of just knowing how much you don't know, which is true for all of us, period. And I think someone was asking me, a psychologist friend was asking me yesterday on his podcast. So, humility is probably easier when things aren't going well in life. How do you stay humble when things are going well in life? Which is a really good question. And I said, I think that, when things are going well, people will compliment me. And so I try to differentiate taking the compliment into my head versus into my heart. I don't believe it in my head. I look at it as blowing smoke. I dismiss it. I minimize it. However, I'm working on taking those compliments into my heart in terms of how they feel about me and how others see me. Because I do believe that other people can see our positive traits far more accurately than we can.
I tell my wife that all the time about her. She's, like a lot of women, faces a lot of self-esteem stuff. And I'm like, if you only saw yourself the way I see you, you would never have any self-esteem issues.
Yes.
So, and I think that's true for us, right?
Yeah. Well, I think part of humility is being in and of the people.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we know that when we get into positions of power, we lose degrees of empathy. And, we know that as far as racism goes, one of the solutions to racism is exposure.
Yeah.
And so, one of the experiments I did, I don't know how this relates to humility, but one of the experiments I did, because I'm aware that we have implicit and explicit bias, right? So we've got conscious and unconscious biases, or you read racism.
Yeah.
And, in trying to increase my self-awareness, I looked at what groups am I willing to speak to if I'm in line at Starbucks or the grocery store, and who am I most likely not to start a conversation with? That's a more difficult question.
Yeah.
That, I didn't really want to know the answer to. And, my answer was Chinese people and Middle Eastern men. So once I had that answer, I'm like, oh shit. Okay, well, let me work on that. And so one of the things I did was, shortly after that awareness, I was invited on a VIP trip to China, where they were inviting Silicon Valley people to come over and try and teach them how to replicate Silicon Valley in a way, which I don't think they can do very easily culturally because of their educational system. It just doesn't. The whole culture is more collectivistic than individualistic and doesn't encourage creativity and innovation, because that's more individualistic.
Yeah, there's an entrepreneurial side to Silicon Valley, right?
There's some structural issues there, or cultural issues. But anyway, so I readily accepted this trip to China, looking to expose myself to the people in the culture in an effort to erase that unconscious bias.
Did it work?
Yeah, I think it worked, tremendously. I think one of my biases is, though, I also like people that are quick and easy to laugh and smile.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the things that my stereotype was holding me back there. My stereotype of Chinese people was holding me back there.
Very reserved. And
Yeah.
so you found that not
Serious.
true. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not always true. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. I tend to gravitate towards people that are like me, right? Like I think that's what we do. So it's hard to reach out, hard to get out of those boxes and engage with people that aren't necessarily, my people, right? Like that's, that's really interesting.
Yeah. So I think, that's part of that self-awareness puzzle too of, are you willing to ask uncomfortable questions of yourself? And then what are you willing to do about it?
Yeah, the doing about it is the hard part, right? Like, I mean, it's like, here's all the things that I need to work on. And, oh, by the way, I've got all this other stuff to do. So I'm going to go do that instead.
I mean, there are much smaller steps that I've taken that don't necessitate a trip to China, for example, because not everyone can do that. However, like, at least if I'm aware of the bias, I can make more effort to interact with Chinese people around me to dispel the bias.
Right.
Like, even if they're just those micro connections of 2-minute interactions waiting in line for a bagel.
Yeah.
And, I'm always trying to connect with people, strangers, in an effort to find something that lights them up or excites them, in an effort, ideally, that we can both walk away with a smile, because those small interactions are cumulative. And if you multiply that out by 6, 10, 8 a day, multiply that over 365 days of the year plus 10 years, like, you systematically change your belief in the fundamental goodness of humanity.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, a lot of times I'm assuming that can just be a smile or a nod or, like I live in a rural area, and it actually has an impact on me when people don't wave when we pass in a car.
Yeah.
Like, and we drive,
well,
when we're a Jeep family. And so in the Jeep culture, it's kind of like the Harley culture.
Yeah.
When you see another Jeep, you wave at each other. And it's like offensive to me when they don't.
Yeah, it's a connection. It's a point of connection.
Yeah, it's a connection that we're supposed to have. And when we miss that, it doesn't happen. So, and I assume and that's something that very readily carries over into your spousal relationships. And we deal a lot with kind of mentoring couples and kind of trying to have that more deeper connection.
Yeah. Well, and I love, so there's a friend of mine at UPenn that has come up with what I think is a brilliant line of research, and he's in positive psychology, but he came up with this idea of primal world beliefs. And primal world beliefs are beliefs that we hold about the world at large. And so there's an overarching belief, and then there's like 20, 25 or 26 other beliefs below that. But the overarching one is the world is good versus bad. And think about that on a 1 to 10 or 1 to 100 scale, right? So there's degrees. And then from there, it breaks down to the world is safe versus dangerous. The world is alive versus mechanistic. The world is enticing versus dull. And so those core beliefs, those primal world beliefs, seem at this point to impact all that we believe, all that we feel, all that we think, and all that we do.
Yeah.
That's huge if that holds true, because I believe that these world beliefs are easily manipulated or easily modified. And at some of them, it's just a choice, right?
Yeah.
And then if you take, and he doesn't do this, but I take it to, there's the beliefs we hold about the world. There's another level of beliefs we hold about people in general. And then there's belief about self. Mm-hmm. But the one that I play around with a lot is this one about beliefs about people. People are good versus bad. People are honest versus dishonest. People are trustworthy versus untrustworthy. People are out to get me versus, would help if I ask. And it's amazing to me because I've talked to some clients and said, like, well, where do you stand on this belief of people are untrustworthy versus trustworthy on a 1 to 100 scale? And this one guy was like, well, I would say 20% of people are trustworthy. I was like, okay, well, I would say 85 to 90% of people are trustworthy and trying their best and, would help if I asked. And I said, and that's fascinating to me because objectively we live in the same world. Mm-hmm. And yet we live in radically different realities.
Maybe he just flies more. I always tell people, I contend that if you think the world is full of really good, nice, giving people, go fly about 100,000 miles in 1 year. And then you have a jaded, because those interactions are different, right? That's this whole microcosm of society.
It's getting people at their worst, at their most tired, at their hurried, at their, stressed. And, then they become more self-absorbed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's an interesting microcosm of society when air travel in and of itself. And I think that's why we're saying in
that same context that you've provided, like, I like to play around with, can I make their day a little bit better? Can I make them smile? Can I work them out of that stressed, hurried mindset? And some people you just can't. But the people that you can are generally quite appreciative.
Yeah, and to their credit, the interesting thing is, you've been on a plane where the plane's delayed. It makes for super fast connections, and the flight attendant comes on and says, "Hey, we've got 4 people on this plane that are seated towards the back, and they have like 15 minutes to get their next plane. Would everybody please stay seated?" And almost never do people actually stay seated and let the people off the plane. But and I fly a lot, but those instances when they do collectively is such a rewarding view of society, because you're like, wow, this is a collective agreement to be nice and kind.
Well, and realize that all it takes to screw that up is 1 or 2 people.
Yeah.
1 or 2 selfish, narcissistic people.
Right.
Because as soon as those people stand up and start getting their bags, it gives others permission to do so. It breaks the contract. And that's one of the real problems that I have with narcissists, is that, for our society to operate, we need to trust one another. And narcissists will feed off that and abuse it. And it pisses me off.
Yeah. And we've, it seems like, and you may agree or disagree, that we've now, over the last decade, we've created way more narcissists than we've had in the past.
It's on the upswing. Yeah. Particularly because of social media, among other things. But it's funny, I did a podcast episode on narcissists, and my ex-wife has some pretty strong narcissistic tendencies. And so I was talking about it, and I got a little bit angry and it accidentally slipped out of my mouth, and I called narcissists rat effers.
Oh, wow.
And I completed it, and I thought, oh man, should I edit that out? And I never edit my podcast. So I was like, screw it, I'll just leave it in. And so then the next day on social media, I said, I issued an apology. And very sincerely, I said, you know what, I let this term slip, and I'm really sorry. And I need to apologize that F rats, because it was totally unfair of me to compare them to narcissists. Because people that screw rats, at least they only harm rats.
I love it.
Narcissists screw people, and they damage people, and I'm tired of it.
Yeah.
I mean, so much of my work has been trying to restore people that have been damaged by a narcissist. And I've got a strong opinion.
Yeah, obviously, which is great. That's, that's part of you being self-aware. Well, I've taken up a ton of your time. I appreciate you kind of dealing with me on the technical issues. This has been super interesting, super helpful. What steps would you take if people want to get in touch with you, if they want to take I know you've got some books and, other resources. What's the first step?
Yeah, you can. So the podcast is The Evolved Caveman. I think you can go to theevolvedcaveman.com. The podcast is available on all major platforms. There's guide2self.com. There's, coaching packages available there if you want to do individual work. I currently have a men's group that I see virtually on Wednesday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific. And that's got a couple of openings if you want a cheap way to work with me.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I love and that's probably a great way to connect with other men and go through those as well.
There's something really special about being with a group of men that is compassionate, empathetic, supportive, where you can take either your lousy stuff that's happening to you or your wins, and we'll get support or celebration either way. And there's something very different about being able to be honest and authentic with other men versus I think what we typically do, which is we have that one woman in our life that we can kind of share all our stuff with. Radically different to do it with a group of men.
Yeah, it's the dynamic is so different. I tell my wife that you get the best and the worst of me.
Yeah.
And it's I personally have a really difficult time, doing that with any of my friends. So
it takes work. Like it takes some practice. It takes some trust. Yeah. I just want to say, Kevin, I really appreciate the work you're doing and that you've done. So thank you for what you're doing.
I'm doing my best, right? We're all kind of doing our best. And I think like those that go into psychology, they're trying to get introspective, right? There's a part of that that's learning to more about myself so I can help other people.
Yeah. How do I heal
other
myself?
men especially. Yeah. And it's, I'm 50 years old. I've been married for 28 years. I have great kids. I have good businesses, and I'm trying to share whatever I can from myself and from experts like you to then, help these men to do more and to at least take some steps, take whatever that first step is that you need to kind of get off the couch, whether it's mentally or physically. And,
I'm no expert. I'm just a court jester.
Hey, the court jester is an expert in something, right?
Court jester is always worried about survival because he exists at the whim of the king. And some of my clients, if they're worth like hundreds of millions of dollars, you say the wrong thing to them, they'll drown you in a lawsuit for the rest of your life and destroy me.
That's a stressful
I had one
niche for sure.
That was one of the heads of an international crime syndicate.
Wow.
And then he turned on that. And then he had like 150,000 people that wanted him dead.
Yeah, that's a deep coaching situation.
So I'm not. This isn't hyperbole when I talk about the court jester and speaking truth to power with some degree of personal risk.
Yeah, that's kind of crazy, actually. That's definitely, getting down to a particular niche.
Yeah.
One that most people wouldn't do, but, kudos to you for being willing. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, whether you're a $100 million CEO or the custodian at a high school, we pretty much all deal with the same issues.
Yep. And that's why I love that level of emotion, right? Because I can connect with anybody in the world on the level of emotion.
Right.
That's a beautiful thing to have.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we can all do a little bit better today than we were yesterday.
Absolutely.
All right, Dr. John, thank you so much. I appreciate you.
You bet. I appreciate you too. Thanks for having me.
If you're looking to really maximize your life and become the man you were made to be, head over to maxedoutman.com and get your journey started today.